I never thought much about my stepsister, Emily. We weren't close, just two people forced to live under the same roof after our parents got married. She was quiet, a little distant, and spent most of her time either in her room or out in the barn with the horses. I figured it was just her way of dealing with the whole blended family situation. But then I started noticing things. Strange things. Emily had always loved the horses, but over the last few weeks, something changed. She started spending a lot of time in the barn. More than usual. At first, it was just during the day, but then she began sneaking out at night. I would hear the back door creak open around midnight, the soft shuffle of her footsteps disappearing into the darkness. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she just liked the quiet. Maybe she was stressed. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what she was doing out there. The first night I followed her. It was a little after midnight when I heard the door open again. I waited, heart pounding, listening as her footsteps faded into the night. I counted to 10, then slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I crept toward the window. Pulling the curtain back just enough, I saw her silhouette moving through the moonlit yard, a lantern swinging in her hand. She was heading toward the barn. I didn't hesitate. Throwing on a hoodie, I slipped outside, keeping to the shadows. The night air was cool, the grass damp beneath my bare feet. My pulse quickened as I neared the barn, the faint glow of Emily's lantern flickering through the wooden slats. I held my breath and pressed myself against the barn wall, peering through a small crack. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Emily stood in the center of the barn, facing one of the stalls. Inside, I could see our biggest stallion, his dark coat gleaming in the dim light. His name was Midnight, a strong and powerful horse that my stepfather was particularly proud of. Emily reached up, running her fingers through his mane. Her movements were slow, almost too gentle. Midnight let out a low snort, shifting his weight, but he didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned into her touch. I frowned. Something about the way she was touching him didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the casual, affectionate way she'd always handled the horses. It was different, intimate. Then I heard her whispering. Her voice was soft, too low for me to make out the words, but there was something about her tone that sent a shiver down my spine. Midnight flicked his ears, responding with a quiet whinny. I pressed myself closer against the wall, straining to hear. Emily laughed softly. It wasn't the kind of laugh you'd expect from someone standing in a barn in the middle of the night. It was warm, breathy, personal. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was I witnessing? I knew I shouldn't be watching, but I couldn't stop myself. I moved toward the side entrance, the door slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The scent of hay and horse filled my nostrils as I crouched behind a stack of feed bags, barely daring to breathe. Emily was still standing beside Midnight, her fingers trailing down his neck. She was smiling. I felt my stomach twist. Something was wrong. She wasn't acting like a girl checking on her horse. She was acting like a girl sneaking away to meet someone. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. Emily reached up and pressed her forehead against Midnight's. She closed her eyes, her hands gripping the sides of his face. Midnight stood completely still, as if he understood something I didn't. Then she whispered, "I can't stay away from you." I felt my breath hitch. Did I hear that right? I stayed frozen behind the stack of feed bags, my heart hammering in my chest. Emily still had her forehead pressed against Midnight's, her hands tangled in his thick mane. The way she was holding him, it wasn't like how you'd hold a horse. It was how you'd hold someone. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was she just overly affectionate with the horses? Was I imagining things? Or was something seriously wrong here? I shifted my weight slightly, trying to hear what she was saying. Her voice was soft, almost reverent, and every word made my stomach twist. "I dream about you," she murmured, running her fingers along Midnight's neck. "All the time, every night." Midnight let out a low snort, shifting his weight. Emily giggled softly, pressing her hand to his chest as if to calm him. I clenched my jaw. What the hell was I listening to? Emily took a deep breath, stepping back slightly, but her hand still lingered on Midnight's side. She bit her lip, as if she were struggling with something, and then she whispered, If they knew about us, they'd never understand. I felt eyes crawl up my spine. Us. She said us. A sharp chill ran through me as I realized I was shaking. Every instinct screamed at me to stop watching, to pretend I never saw any of this. But I couldn't. I had to do something. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like lead as I stepped out from behind the feed bags, my voice rough and unsteady. Emily? Emily gasped, her whole body jolting as she whipped around to face me. Her eyes were wide, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Midnight let out a startled whinny, shifting slightly in his stall. Jake, she stammered, taking a step back. What are you doing here? I folded my arms, ignoring the way my stomach twisted. I should be asking you the same thing. Her face turned pale. She stopped, glancing back at Midnight. I was just checking on him. I raised an eyebrow. At midnight? Every night. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. He gets restless. He needs me. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Emily, I'm not stupid. I've been watching you. I've seen you sneaking out here every night. You're not just checking on him. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then, suddenly, her expression hardened. You don't get it, she hissed, her voice sharp and defensive. You wouldn't understand. I took a step closer. Then explain it to me. She shook her head violently, gripping the sides of her hoodie. No, you'll ruin everything. You'll ruin us. There it was again. That word. I demanded the truth. Emily, I said, my voice low. What the hell is going on between you and that horse? Her breathing was ragged now. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. It's not like that. Then what is it like? I snapped. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then whispered. It's love. I stared at her, my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. You're in love with Midnight? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she was going to deny it. But then she let out a shuddering breath, her eyes shining with something I couldn't name. I don't expect you to understand, she said. My mind felt like it was spinning, like I'd stepped into some sick dream I couldn't wake up from. Emily, my stepsister, thought she was in love with a horse. I took a shaky step backward, struggling to process everything. Emily, I whispered, this isn't. She cut me off. This is real, she said fiercely. You don't know what it's like to feel something so strong, so right. You've never felt this way about anyone, have you? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I stood there, frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. My brain was scrambling for something, anything to say, but I was at a complete loss. Every rational thought told me this wasn't real, that I had to be misunderstanding something. Emily's eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, pleading, daring me to challenge what she had just said. Emily, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. You're not thinking straight. Her expression hardened. That's what you think? That I'm crazy? You have no idea what it's like. She cut me off, her voice shaking. To love something with your whole heart and know that no one will ever understand. To feel something so deep, so real, and have everyone tell you it's wrong. I opened my mouth, but she kept going. All my life, I felt alone, she whispered, her hands trembling at her sides. You wouldn't understand. You never felt the way I do. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't Emily. Not the Emily I knew. She took a step toward me, her eyes wild and desperate. You won't tell anyone, right? I couldn't answer. My mind was still reeling from what she had just admitted, from the way she was looking at me, begging me to accept something I couldn't even wrap my head around. She took my silence as hesitation. Jake, please. I let out a shaky breath, running a hand through my hair. Emily, A sudden noise from behind made me jolt. Midnight shifted in his stall, his deep brown eyes watching us, watching me. A chill crawled up my spine. Emily turned, her entire posture softening the moment her eyes landed on him. She stepped forward, reaching up to stroke his face with slow, deliberate movements. He understands me, she murmured. He listens. He's always listened. I felt something inside me snap. This isn't normal, Emily. My voice was sharp, too sharp, but I didn't care anymore. You're acting like. She whipped around so fast I barely had time to react. Like what? She spat. Like someone in love? My jaw clenched. Like someone who needs help? Her entire body went stiff. For a moment, I thought she might scream, might break down, might do something, but instead, she just laughed. A soft, bitter, haunted laugh. You won't understand, she whispered, shaking her head. You never will. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. Emily, I need you to come inside. We need to talk about this. I'm not leaving, she said, stepping closer to Midnight. I belong here. No, you don't, I said, stepping forward, reaching for her. You belong with people. Midnight let out a loud, sharp snort, stomping his hoof. I swear I saw Emily smile. I swear she whispered something under her breath, something too soft for me to hear. And then, without another word, she turned away from me. Like I wasn't even there. Like I didn't exist. A horrible, suffocating feeling settled over me, my skin crawling with something I couldn't explain. I took one last look at her, her body leaning into Midnight, her fingers brushing against his mane, the way she whispered to him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. And I turned around. I walked out of the barn, into the cold night air, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't, because no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I had imagined it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just lost my sister. Not to another person, not even to herself, but to something else entirely. And that terrified me. I didn't talk to Emily the next day. I couldn't. Every time I thought about what had happened in the barn, my stomach twisted into knots. I kept telling myself I had misunderstood, that I was reading too much into things. But the look in her eyes, the way she touched Midnight, the way she whispered to him like he was the only thing keeping her alive. No, I hadn't imagined it. She meant every word. I spent the entire morning trying to act normal. My stepdad was out of town, and my mom was busy with errands, so it was just me and Emily in the house. I could hear her moving around upstairs, her footsteps soft and slow, like she was drifting through the day in a haze. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pretend everything was fine. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it ate at me. I had to do something. By the time night rolled around, I had made up my mind. I was going to follow her again. And this time, I was going to get answers. The house was silent when the clock struck midnight. I stayed in my room, barely breathing, waiting for the familiar sound of the back door creaking open. It came right on schedule. I slipped out of bed, heart pounding, and moved to the window. The lantern light flickered in the distance, swaying as Emily made her way toward the barn. I grabbed my hoodie and followed. The night air was cool against my skin, the grass damp with evening dew. I kept my footsteps light, careful not to make a sound. By the time I reached the barn, the door was already closed. I hesitated for a second, my fingers hovering over the wooden handle. Then, slowly, I pushed it open. The lantern was hanging from a hook near the entrance, casting long shadows across the walls. I moved inside, staying low, keeping to the darkness. Emily was standing in Midnight's stall, and she wasn't alone. My breath caught in my throat. She had changed into something different, her usual hoodie and jeans replaced with a thin, flowing nightgown. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders in soft waves. She looked different. In Midnight, he was still, too still, like he was waiting for something. My skin prickled with unease. Emily stepped closer to him, running her hands along his back, her movements slow, almost reverent. Then she whispered something I couldn't hear. Midnight let out a deep, slow exhale, his ears flicking toward her. Emily smiled. I swallowed hard. This was wrong. So wrong. I had to stop it. I stepped forward, my voice coming out hoarse and strained. Emily. She froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. The barn felt too quiet, like the world had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. Then she turned, slowly, her expression unreadable. Her eyes met mine and something shifted, something I couldn't explain. Jake, she whispered. Her voice sounded different, like she wasn't surprised to see me, like she had been expecting me. A slow chill crawled down my spine. "Emily, you need to stop this," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "This isn't normal." She tilted her head slightly, studying me like I was the one acting strange. "What isn't normal?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" "This. Sneaking out here every night, acting like." My throat tightened. "Like you're in love with him." Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment I thought she was going to laugh. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled, a slow, knowing, almost pitying smile. "You still don't get it," she murmured. My pulse spiked. "What the hell does that mean?" I snapped. Emily exhaled softly and turned back toward Midnight. She lifted her hand, fingers brushing over his muzzle. He didn't move. "Jake," she whispered, not looking at me. "Do you believe in fate?" I felt my stomach drop. "What?" She ran her fingers through Midnight's mane, her voice distant. "Some things, they're meant to happen, no matter what." A shiver rolled through me. "This isn't fate," I said, my voice shaking. "This is—" She turned to face me again, and her eyes weren't the same. They were darker, too dark, like the Emily I knew was slipping away, piece by piece, leaving something else behind. Something I didn't recognize. I took a slow step back. "I don't think you should be here," she said softly. The hair on my arm stood up. Something wasn't right. And for the first time since this all started, I felt afraid. I took another step back, my hands tightening in a fist at my sides. My whole body was telling me to leave, to turn around and walk out of that barn and never look back. But I couldn't. Not when Emily was standing there, looking at me like I was the one who didn't belong, like I was the one who didn't understand. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Emily, what's happening to you?" She tilted her head, blinking slowly, almost too slowly. Her lips parted, and for a second, I thought she was going to say something, but then her gaze flicked toward Midnight. Her expression softened, like I wasn't even there anymore. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Emily," I tried again, taking a hesitant step forward. She turned back to me, her face unreadable. "You shouldn't be here, Jake." The way she said my name, it wasn't how she used to say it. There was something off about it, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I clenched my jaw. "I live here." A small, breathy laugh escaped her lips. "Do you?" My stomach twisted. "What the hell does that mean?" She didn't answer. She just smiled. And then Midnight moved. It wasn't much, just a slow shift of weight, a flick of his tail, but the moment he did, Emily reacted. Her whole body tensed, her breath hitching in her throat, her fingers trembling as they grazed his side. It was too much, too intimate. I felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. I had to stop this. "Emily," I said, my voice sharper than before. "Come inside. Now." She didn't move. "Emily." Nothing. She just stood there, her breathing unsteady, her eyes locked on Midnight. I reached for her. The moment my fingers brushed her arm, she flinched, like I had burned her. Her head snapped toward me, her expression twisting into something I didn't recognize. I pulled my hand back fast, my heart pounding. "What's wrong with you?" She blinked, and for a second, just a second, her face flickered, like she didn't know who I was, like she didn't know who she was. A thick silence filled the barn. I took a slow step backward. "I don't know what's happening to you, but You wouldn't understand," she whispered. Her voice was flat, emotionless. I swallowed hard. "Then help me," I said. "Help me understand." She stared at me for a long moment. Then, finally, she spoke. "I can't." A chill rushed through me. She wasn't saying she wouldn't. She was saying she couldn't. Like it was too late. Like she had already slipped too far into whatever this was. And then she turned back to Midnight, her hands shaking as she reached for him. I felt sick. This wasn't right. I took another step back, my breath coming out uneven. "Emily, if you don't come inside with me right now, I'm telling Dad." She froze. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. Then, slowly, she turned to look at me. And the look in her eyes, I felt my stomach drop. There was no fear, no panic, no recognition, just an eerie, quiet calm. Then she whispered, "Do whatever you want, Jake." I couldn't breathe. Emily had always been quiet, always distant. But this was something else, something I didn't have a name for. And for the first time since this all started, I realized I wasn't just afraid for her anymore. I was afraid of her. I couldn't move. Emily just stood there, her fingers resting lightly on Midnight's side, her eyes still locked onto mine. There was something in the way she was looking at me, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was acceptance, like she had already made peace with something, like she knew something I didn't. My hands curled in a fist at my sides. "Emily, I'm serious," I said, my voice shaking. "Come inside. Now." She didn't react. I took another step forward. "Emily, if you don't." Midnight moved. It was small, just the way his head turned slightly, the way his ears flicked. But the second he did, Emily exhaled like she had been holding her breath for hours, like his movement had given her permission. And then she spoke. But not to me. "See?" she whispered, running her fingers down his neck. "He understands." A shiver crawled up my spine. She was talking to him, like he could talk back. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "Emily, stop." She didn't. Instead, she leaned in closer, her forehead resting against his. Her hands tightened in his mane. Her body melted against him, and a soft, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. Midnight stood still, too still, like he was waiting. I took a shaky breath. "I don't know what's going on with you, but Jake." Her voice was barely a whisper. I hesitated. "What?" She finally turned to look at me again, and her eyes weren't the same. Something had changed. They were darker. Not like she was tired. Not like she was upset. Like she wasn't her. The barn was too quiet. The air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, like something was pushing me back toward the door. I took an unconscious step backward. Emily smiled. A small, soft, knowing smile. Then she whispered, "It's too late, Jake." My stomach dropped. I had no idea what she meant, and I didn't want to. I turned, bolting for the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't trying to process anything. I just knew I needed to leave. But the second my fingers touched the barn door, I heard something, a breath, a deep, slow, deliberate breath. Behind me, I stopped cold. My skin prickled. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head. Emily was still standing there, still smiling. But Midnight was looking at me. Not just looking, staring. And his eyes, they weren't a horse's eyes. They were too deep, too knowing. Like they understood something I didn't. Like they had always understood. I felt my blood turn to ice. My vision blurred. My stomach lurched. Then Emily whispered, voice barely audible. "Now you see." I didn't scream. I couldn't. I turned, slammed the barn door open, and ran. I ran through the yard, through the trees, through the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind reeling. I didn't look back. I didn't dare, because I knew, if I did, something would be following me. Something that wasn't Emily. Something that wasn't Midnight. Something else. I didn't stop running until I reached the house. I slammed the door behind me, my breath ragged, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn the lock. The house was dark, empty, but even in the silence, I felt watched. I pressed my back against the door, sucking in deep, desperate gulps of air. My heart pounded in my chest, my vision blurring around the edges. I couldn't think. I couldn't process. All I could see were those eyes. Midnight's eyes. No, not Midnight's. Because that thing in the barn, it wasn't him. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing. Emily's voice echoed inside my skull. "Now you see." See what? What the hell had I seen? I wanted to believe I was losing it, that I had imagined everything, that my brain was twisting shadows and whispers into something they weren't. But I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I saw, and that terrified me more than anything. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling against the door, before I forced myself to move. My limbs felt weak, like my body had been drained of everything keeping it together. I needed answers. I needed to wake up from this nightmare. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone. The police? No. What the hell would I even tell them? Hey, my stepsister thinks she's in love with a horse. But surprise, He might not be a horse. Yeah, that would go over well. I needed proof. I needed to go back to the barn. My stomach turned at the thought, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let this fester in my head, twisting itself into something worse. I had to face it, even if I didn't want to. I waited until the first light of dawn. The house was still silent. My mom and stepdad were still gone, and Emily, I didn't know where she was. Maybe she was still in the barn. Maybe she had slipped back inside sometime during the night. I wasn't ready to find out. I grabbed the heaviest flashlight I could find, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. And then, before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped outside. The morning air was too still. Everything felt off. I swallowed hard as I approached the barn, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door was slightly open, like it had been waiting for me. I pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped inside. The lantern was still lit, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. The smell of hay and dust filled my nose. My heart pounded as my eyes swept the stalls, looking for Midnight, looking for... I froze. Midnight's stall was empty. The door was wide open. And Emily. Emily was gone. A sharp chill ran through me. I stepped closer, my breath slow and uneven. The barn felt wrong, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't mine anymore. I peered into the stall, my stomach twisting. The hay was disturbed, like something had been thrashing there, like something had changed. And then I saw it. Something was scratched into the wooden beams. Jagged, uneven, like someone had carved it in a hurry. 3 words. 3 horrible words. Now you see. My body locked up. A rush of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the stall door to keep from collapsing. I turned, chest heaving, my head spinning, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. I had to get out. I had to. Something moved. A breath. A deep, slow breath. Right behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. My whole body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, trapped in my own skin. The breath came again. Closer this time. Too close. And then, a voice. Soft. Whispering. A voice that wasn't mine. A voice that wasn't Emily's. Jake. I finally moved. I bolted out of the barn, my feet slamming against the dirt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I wouldn't, because if I did, I knew I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the house, my lungs burning, my body shaking so violently I could barely get my hands to work. I fumbled with the doorknob, shoved the door open, and slammed it shut behind me. Silence. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house felt different. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. Something was wrong. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. I needed to call someone, anyone. I needed to get out of here, to get help, to tell someone what I saw. But the moment I unlocked the screen, I froze. My wallpaper, it wasn't the same. The picture of me and my stepdad from last year's fishing trip was gone. In its place, a photo of the barn, taken from the inside, the stall door wide open. The words, "Now you see," scratched into the wood. I dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the screen flashing before going black. My pulse spiked. No. I hadn't taken that picture. I hadn't been in the stall long enough. So, who did? I took a shaky step back. My head pounded. My thoughts swirled. Then, a creak. From upstairs. My stomach turned to ice. I wasn't alone. I knew that sound. It was the sound the floor made when someone stepped into the hallway outside my room. Another creak. Closer. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the stairs. Every part of me screamed to get out, run, leave, but my feet wouldn't obey. Slowly, I climbed the steps, each one making my chest tighten more. I reached the top. The hallway was dark. Too dark. My room was at the end, the door slightly open. Someone had been inside. I swallowed hard. Emily? No answer. I took a step forward, then another. My breath hitched. I reached the door, my fingers barely brushing the wood. And then, a whisper. Jake. Behind me. I spun so fast I nearly tripped. The hallway was empty. But I wasn't stupid. I felt it. Something was there. watching me, waiting. I turned back to my room, my body locked up. I couldn't do this. I needed to leave. Now. I turned to run, and something grabbed my wrist. I screamed. I twisted, yanking my arm back, my pulse exploding in my veins. I saw it just for a second. A hand. A pale, too long hand with fingers that curled too tight around my skin. Then it let go. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged. And I finally saw it. The mirror at the end of the hall. And my reflection. But it wasn't me. The thing looking back at me. It had my face. But its eyes weren't mine. They were dark. Too deep. Like midnight's. Like Emily's. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The reflection smiled. And then it whispered. Now you see. The lights flickered. The house groaned. And everything went black.